Play.
Good evening and greetings from the Department of English, SIS College of Arts, Science and Commerce, Sion West, Mumbai. Our respected guest of honor, Dr. Pramod K Nayar, Principal Dr. Uma Shankar, Vice Principals Dr. Satish Sarfare, Dr. Rashmi Bure, Dr. Tara Menon and Vinod Menon, IQAC coordinators, Professor Geeta Paluskar and Dr. Kamala Srinivas, faculty from across the country and the UAE, research scholars and my dear students. Trauma theory has been viewed variously by researchers as an attempt at reclaiming an ethical space for deconstruction, as well as a useful critical tool for interrogating the relationship between referentiality and historical violence. The theme of our national webinar, Cultural Trauma, Biopolitics and Precarious Lives in the 21st Century, attempts to add another dimension to it. In order to ensure that we are able to listen to our guest today, Dr. Nayar, clearly, I would request all the attendees to keep their audio and video off. Without wasting any further time, I now call upon our principal, Dr. Uma Shankar, to deliver the formal welcome address. Over to you, ma'am.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, our chief guest, Dr. Pramod Nayar, colleagues, research scholars, students, and friends who have joined across India and beyond India. It gives me immense pleasure to welcome each one of you for this national webinar on a very interesting and intriguing topic on which all of us would love to dwell on for some more time. Whether it's a cultural trauma or a trauma of any of its kind is giving us a lot of opportunity to ponder, introspect, and find some solutions to it. Long ago, Mahatma Gandhi said a nation's culture resides in the hearts and in the soul of its people. Now, today we question where are the hearts and the soul, because the culture itself has become a big question. As we are standing at academicians come together to talk about it, review it, and introspect and discuss and debate on it. This forum is such a kind of a place where we are very eagerly waiting to listen to Dr. Nayar, whose expertise is wonderful, with so many kind of talks that he has delivered, the amount of books and articles that he has published. Definitely, this will be a very enriching experience to give us another dimension to this entire issue that we are planning to read. Sorry, somewhere my voice is going. Fine. I take this opportunity once again to welcome each one of you, and I'm sure that this program will be a great success as so many students will be able to listen to Dr. Nayar's academic excellence. I once again welcome you, Dr. Nayar, and I also wish to tell you that SIS is open to you. Whenever things are all right, please come to college and meet us in person. That would really delight us. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am, for those kind words. It is my honor and privilege to introduce our guest for today, Dr. Pramod K Nayar. Dr. Nayar has been teaching at the Department of English, University of Hyderabad, India since 2001. A recipient of several awards and fellowships, Dr. Nayar has authored 12 books, the most recent ones being Essays in Celebrity Culture, published by Anthem in 2021, the Human Rights graphic novel published by Routledge 2021, the Indian Travel Writing in the Age of the Empire, brought out by Bloomsbury in 2020, and Eco-Precarity, published by Routledge in 2019. Some of the awards and fellowships that deserve to be mentioned here are the Smuts Visiting Fellow in Commonwealth Studies, University of Cambridge from 2000 to 2001, the Charles Wallace India Trust British Council Fellowship, University of Kent at Canterbury, UK in 2001, the Junior Fellowship, Department of Culture, Government of India from 2000 to 2002, the Fulbright Senior Fellow, Cornell University, USA from 2005 to 2006, and the most recent one being the Visitors Award for Research in Arts, Humanities and Social Sciences from the President of India in 2018. Dr. Nayar serves on the editorial boards of the Indian Journal of Gender Studies, Celebrity Studies, Journal of Postcolonial Writing, Journeys, besides being a reviewer and referee for dozens of journals and publishers worldwide. He's a coveted speaker and has lectured at Oxford, Edinburgh, Roehampton, Sussex, Sheffield, Hallam, South Carolina, Dayton, Columbia, Guwahati, and other institutions. With 12 books, 13 chapters in books, 48 journal articles, 4 editorials, 4 reviews, 1 short survey, and 292 citations of his work to his credit, it is no wonder that he is an internationally acclaimed theorist and academician who does our country proud. Sir, we are indeed honored by your presence here and request you to now deliver your lecture entitled Cultural Trauma, Biopolitics, and Precarious Lives in the 21st Century.
Thank you very much, Professor Lakshmi and Professor Umashankar for that welcome. I have been unable to share my screen. I will be requesting the organizers to put up what I think is the appropriate slide at the appropriate moment.
Yeah.
So it's a bit of a nuisance, I understand.
No, not at all. You can just ask me to move ahead next, and that'll be my cue, yeah?
Right, okay.
Yeah.
When the idea came up that I speak about cultural trauma, one of the first things I thought, because I have a rather weird mind, is listening to webinars itself is an index of cultural trauma. And students being asked to sit in, faculty being asked to participate in webinars when they would actually be doing something else is itself culturally traumatic. But of course, you cannot document it because nobody will speak about it. And very few will have the option of saying, oh my God, that was terrible. So there isn't much that people can do when it comes to talking about certain things. Trauma technically means injury. And most of the time when people speak about trauma, they mean psychic and psychological trauma, which is personal, to do with your interiority, to do with your subjectivity. However, that has also been interpreted primarily from psychoanalytic terms. Kathy Carruth's work on trauma being, of course, the most cited, 1994, and subsequently Shoshana Feldman and several others writing about trauma and injury. That, to many people, including myself, has been a rather limiting way of even acknowledging trauma, because psychic trauma, psychological, emotional trauma, is often shared, is often part of a collective setup. Now, this is not to refute or negate individual trauma or people's sense of being traumatized or people's sense of being injured. We are not taking away psychological trauma. Let's get that very clear right at the outset. It's a kind of ground clearing gesture that I'm making here. So it's not that one denies the power, the horror, the terror of personal psychological trauma. My view is that in many cases, what you suffer as an individual is because you are a member of a particular community. It's because you are a member of a collective, of a group. Take any example of genocides, of mass persecution, and you'll quickly discover that X has been killed or beaten or injured or arrested because he or she is a Jew, a Black, a Native American, a minority, you name it. In short, the way in which trauma operates cannot be discussed solely at the level of an individual. It needs a much broader canvas across which trauma is writ large and therefore demands a maybe slightly different approach to it. In what I have to say, I will be looking at trauma that is of that nature. In fact, as you will discover towards the latter part of my talk, my interest lies not an individual trauma. Like I said, I am not dismissing it, but I think there's scope for doing things differently. My interest is in trauma that comes because of your identity, your participation in being a member of a particular community. And for me, in my talk today, I am interested, as some of you might know, in much larger scales of trauma. So I'm scaling it up. I'm interested in much larger scales of trauma, specifically things like eco-precarity, which is the title of one of my books. And I'm also interested in trauma that impinges upon bodies, human bodies, hence my second term, biopolitics. Let me first define these terms. Slide 1, please. Cultural trauma. Cultural trauma actually occurs, as Jeff Alexander would say, when a group of people believe they have been subjected to or been traumatized by something that affects them or afflicts them as a group. It's a very easy working definition of cultural trauma that I am employing here. And the references are there for you because Professor Lakshmi told me that several of you are working on trauma and partition and things like that. So I thought I know it looks a little textbookish and following conventions of publishing, but it's useful for you people, for the students particularly, I would hope. So cultural trauma is something that afflicts a large group of people where their identities determine the nature of trauma that they experience. A second, slightly more elaborate definition. I'm sorry, there is a lot of text on that, but there's no way you can. I did try and edit some of it, but this is a very useful book, Ron Ehrman's on cultural trauma and slavery, where he speaks about the memory of slavery as itself being traumatic. And the first line should tell you where I'm going with this. Trauma is collective memory. Trauma is shared memory. Allow me to qualify this. The African American may not, in the 21st century, have experienced slavery firsthand. He or she is not a slave in the purest sense of slavery as practiced in the 19th century. But the point Ron Ehrman makes in this neat little book is trauma is inherited and is transgenerational because it's participating in a collective memory process through which descendants of those who experienced slavery also participate in a certain kind of trauma. Now, please understand this. The experience of traumatic memory is being treated as an instantiation of cultural trauma, even if you yourself did not experience, never experienced slavery of, say, your great-grandfather. In short, we are speaking about cultural trauma as something that is transmitted across generations. It's carried from generation to generation. This is an important point. You only have to look at Jewish writings now or African American writings now to understand this. So when Toni Morrison writes, when later day, like Harold Finkelman, later day Jewish writers like Harold Finkelman write, they are not people who themselves were incarcerated in a concentration camp in Nazi Germany or in Auschwitz in Poland. No. But the inheritance of a collective memory and a collective identity means that their identities are in many ways determined by what happened to their grandparents several years or decades or maybe even a century ago. So cultural trauma is inheritable, transmissible. So that's my second, that's my main definition. Biopolitics, which is the next slide. Biopolitics is, as you can make out from the term itself, something that brings together biology and politics. I'm not going to delve into the nitty-gritties of what biopolitics means, because that's an entirely different essay. It's an area of some interest to me, considering I work in posthumanism and things like that. But biopolitics was something that Michel Foucault been very popular, followed by people like Paul Rabinow, a commentator on Foucault. Biopolitics is the control of biology at the individual level and at the level of the community, which means it's control of biology through the control exercised by, say, biotechnology, scientific policies, institutions such as Center for Disease Control, our hospital network, primary health centers, which control us as individuals, but also in the form of a larger community. It can take many forms. It could be about surrogate wombs for hire, which is now a controversy, as some of you might know. And there's a bill in the parliament about the regulation of surrogacy. I do not know whether you're aware of it. It can be about organ trafficking, the sale. And I'm sure some of you are aware, if you read the newspapers, that India is a part of a huge transnational racket, a mafia in organ trafficking. The surveillance, surely we all since last March are aware of this, the policing of public health. When you can go out, how do you have to go out, what do you have to do before you go out, etc., etc. The legislative measures, the law enforcement measures that have been put in place around quarantining facilities, but also the targeting of certain populations as causal factors in the spread of COVID-19. And some of you may remember or may have read that when AIDS appeared on the scene in the 80s, the homosexuals were targeted and beaten up in public as potential threats to the health of the society itself. Biopolitics is the targeting of individuals and populations. So the documentation of health and sickness, and the nature of a biological citizenship. Biological citizenship is a term coined by the anthropologist Adriana Petrina to talk about survivors of Chernobyl. It's an important idea because I'm sorry, I'm getting some crosstalk in my ears. Somebody's somebody's mic needs to be muted, please. I'm getting a lot of crosstalk. Professor Lakshmi, I need some muting done.
Done, sir.
Right. Okay. Thank you. So to get back to the point I was making, this is the key focus of a lot of politics, institutional legislation, law enforcement, but biology is part of a regulatory network. My fourth point is about cultural trauma and citizenship, where the argument I'm making is that participation in trauma entails a certain kind of what I am calling here trauma memory citizenship. Trauma memory citizenship is the making of an individual's identity via the experience of trauma, recollected as a collective memory project. Partition survivors, Holocaust survivors, World War I veterans, genocide survivors in Rwanda. What are these large categories we are talking about? These large categories are actually inheriting of memories of a particular trauma at some point in the historical past, and your identity is defined as a survivor, a later generation descendant of that particular traumatized community. So there is an intrinsic link between memory, trauma, and citizenship. What I'm referring to as trauma memory citizenship. This is a political category. This is a political subject emerging out of a sense of being wronged, the memory of being wronged. This is important for precisely the reason that I outlined at the beginning, that communities are known by what they have suffered. Next, precarity and precarious lives. Precarious lives, a concept made popular by Judith Butler in 2 books in 2004 and 2009. Extremely influential text now. Also critiqued, let's not dispute that. And the idea that people are vulnerable, open to being injured. Precarity is a shared condition. All of us are vulnerable, but not all of us are helpless. Children, the sick, and the old are helpless. All of us are vulnerable. To be vulnerable is to be open to injury. Vulness. The word vulness means injury from the Latin. So all of us are vulnerable, but not all of us are helpless. The point is, we become helpless in certain structural conditions. Helplessness is a consequence not of who you are alone. As humans, we are vulnerable, but you're helpless because certain conditions make you helpless. Disease, pollution, radiation, war are all contexts in which human beings who are by definition vulnerable are rendered helpless. I'm narrowing it down, as you can see, starting with trauma as a large category and narrowing it down. My interest is in something I have designated eco-precarity, which is a merger of, it's a portmanteau term of ecology and precarity. It's a book I did some time ago. And it's part of something I have been interested in for some time, because the book which immediately preceded this is on the Bhopal tragedy, where I speak about the biopolitical uncanny and disaster, which also was interested in questions of vulnerability. Why? Because the structural condition of an industrial disaster transforms vulnerable people into helpless people. And I have a few definitions of eco-precarity up there for you. I'm not going to read all of that. That is up to you to get your teachers to discuss with you. But there are a couple of things I would like to point to. Eco-precarity now consists of a fear of losing your species identity. What do we mean by that? Let me start with a basic assumption. I wear glasses, as you can see. I can't see without them. I mean, I can see, but vaguely. Then, as James Thurber would say, I will run into crossbars, faculty, and fall into ponds. Not a very nice way of getting about the day. But I can't see the screen. I can barely see the screen if I don't wear my glasses. So I'm not a person if I don't wear my glasses. There are people with pacemakers, people who need dialysis. Those are people whose lives are determined by machines, whose quality of life is determined by the quality of the machinery to which they are connected. This is also a machine. This is a prosthesis, like people who use walking canes, crutches, pacemakers. Humans have always needed a technological device to survive, whether it is the hammer or the stone to make fire, or the glasses I wear, or the smartphones which are attached to you young people like umbilical cords. I don't think you can be separated from your cell phones. Some of you may have got it already implanted, wearable technologies. Right? We have always been posthuman in one sense. And it's an area of some interest to me, how the posthuman has evolved. But, and that's the point I would like to come to, increasingly you discover that the human being is not a coherent, self-contained creature. Let me give you just one example. You digest what you eat. Because there are 10 raised to power 14 bacteria in your stomach. If those bacteria die, you cannot digest your food. And that's why people who have celiac disease, for instance, or gluten allergy, for instance, need to take probiotics like yeast. In short, you are what you are because the bacteria keep you alive. That should humble you a little bit, at least. The assumption that humans are the crown of creation who can't live without bacteria inside their stomachs. Have you any idea how many bacteria reside on your lips or in your armpits? Okay, these are gross details, I understand, and perhaps this is not the best place to talk about these things before SIES college bans me for good for bringing in disgusting biological details into the webinar. But it's a fact of life that you are what you are because other forms of life make what you are. In short, your species boundary is in question. On the one hand, there is a technology that makes you what you are. On the other hand, there are life forms that make what you are. Take a simple example. You are what you are because you are able to breathe the air outside. If you stop breathing your air from outside, you don't live. You need a sustainable environment, a sustaining environment to keep you alive. And the air that is produced by the plants that let out, by the space around us, are what keep you alive. So the idea that there is a self-contained human being closed off, hermetically sealed, is patently false. Humans are part of what Stacey Alaimo has referred to as transcorporeality. But that's a different debate. I'm not going, there's not a lecture on posthumanism. Let's leave it for another day, some other year. But the point I would like to make is eco-precarity is the precariousness of species borders, of species boundaries. And we increasingly worry that we are not what we are or what we thought we were. Think of the numerous science fiction films of humans being contaminated by other bacteria, by other species, starting with the very early film, which many of you in the audience here would not remember, but there is a reboot. The original one starred Donald Sutherland, The Invasion of the Body Snatchers, an early sci-fi film. Also, Ridley Scott's famous Blade Runner, which has now, of course, Ryan Gosling reboot as well. I think it's Ryan Gosling. I don't remember, but yeah. Blade Runner, which originally starred Harrison Ford. Alien, Ridley Scott's Alien, was about species invasion. Think of the dozens of Hollywood films about invasions. Contagion, Outbreak, several of those films. The Jake Gyllenhaal film Life, Species, any number of what has been called the invasion or the outbreak narrative, which is about the invasion of humanity by others. Why is this an interesting and worrying question? Because we worry that we are no longer, or we never were, self-bounded creatures. So precarious lives now is a human trait, and that is something I would like to emphasize. Precarious lives are about the precarious nature of our biology because of anything that might invade us. Think of the zillion zombie films. More famous ones being World War Z, I Am Legend, etc., etc. The Train to Busan, the Korean film, and all that. I'm sure many of you are worrying about my taste in films. It should be a matter of some worry. I work on some of these films. I also work on torture films like Saw. I have a book on that, on extreme cultures. So yeah, I have, to be on the safe side, just say kinky tastes. But yes, the eco-precarity of our lives is about the possible breakdown of species borders, the possible and plausible destruction of our biological boundaries. All right? So this is something I want to emphasize, that eco-precarity is about the potential for the species boundary to be dissolved. For those of you who like some of these films that I've talked about, please pay attention to the fact that humans are transformed into something else. Whether it is Species, the Sigourney Weaver, Ridley Scott original film, whether it is the zombie films where humans become zombies. And I'm sure you have been reading about it in the papers about the zombie apocalypse as well, where we'll all be zombies. Some of you know what that zombies eat brains for a living. I mean, they have rather strange tastes, as we can see. But imagine, as that rather insulting meme from some time ago, imagine a zombie is looking for brains and walks past you. What does it indicate? A zombie is looking for brains and walks past you, lets you alone. What does it indicate? Why are we worried about these zombies? We are worried about zombies because we lead eco-precarious lives, because our biological substrate, our biological identity as humans is under threat. For many people, their bodies were never their own. Slaves, for example, never owned their bodies. Their bodies were owned by their masters. So for many different kinds of people, ethnic minorities, religious minorities, linguistic minorities, the entire idea that they owned their bodies was a rather bizarre one. They never owned their bodies. Now we discover that most of our bodies are owned by a vaccine, which is actually a little bit of the virus. Can you imagine? We are the crown of creation, supposedly. We are cast in the image of God, right? And we have been brought down to our knees by a protein in a jacket, which is basically a virus. A protein in a suit. And we think we are the crown of creation. If this is what species sovereignty is, we are no longer sovereign. That is my thesis. Posthumanism and the work in eco-precarity gestures at the inevitable conclusion that humanity's sovereignty is a myth. We have never been sovereign because we have always been posthuman. We have always been transcorporeal. Right? So that is one of the key statements I would like to make. Now I move on to the second part of my talk, which is going to deal with two specific themes: precarious corporeality and the judicialization of life. I understand the terminology is a little hard to chew, but there's no way around it. Sometimes you need to use these ones. So like I said, precarious corporeality, and I give you the example of the zombie apocalypse. And if you look at I Am Legend, Train to Busan, World War Z, the threat to mankind is from humans who are no longer human. Their corporeal, their subjectivity, their identity, all of this has been converted into something else. They lead precarious lives, if that is what you want to call lives. So all of us will one day become zombies. Good fun, but there will also be some English teachers, I suppose, who will not be zombies, or maybe the zombies will not want English teachers. Who knows? But precarious corporeality is now built into our life itself. And I'm going to use a couple of texts by way of an illustration for what I want to say. The first one is Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale, a cult novel now, a cult TV series, and now has a sequel, The Testaments, which is, at least for me, a big disappointment. In Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale, as some of you may be aware, the women are basically just uteruses. They are kept as functioning wombs so that the human order can continue. It's called a business transaction. And this illustrates the point I was making about biopolitics. Biopolitics is the control of the woman's biological function of maternal reproduction. This entire future that is envisaged in Margaret Atwood's rather horrific tale makes a case for the necessity of reproduction because humanity has to survive, and makes the woman a slave for the larger cause of humanity. And the other text that I have mentioned, the units, we are human capital. The women are human capital. Their wombs are capital. They are resources. They are preserved, taken care of, regulated. Biopolitics is the control over the, it's actually a repro politics. And people have referred to it as reproductive futurism, where the future of humankind hinges upon reproduction, and all biopolitics focuses upon the woman's body, because the woman's body has to be preserved, controlled, regulated as a business transaction. So this is Atwood's vision of biopolitics, predicated upon, contingent upon the woman's body and its reproductive functions. And this is human capital. In The Handmaid's Tale, Atwood would say life is a sexually transmitted social disease. Life is a sexually transmitted social disease, and proceeds to illustrate that the regulation of that disease, the regulation of the bodies that carry that disease, is coterminous with the regulation of healthy wombs. My second example comes from one of my favorite novels, Kazuo Ishiguro's Never Let Me Go. Many of you may know the Keira Knightley film, of course, but I prefer the novel and worked on it. In Never Let Me Go, some of you may be familiar with the theme. There are clones. The clones are created so that they can donate their organs. Donate within quotes. They donate their organs so that humans who have particular diseases or are dying of age can have fresh organs replaced. That is, the clone is a living cadaver, a living donor of the key organs, which will then keep the humans alive. They don't own their bodies. This is again a futuristic apocalyptic novel. Not quite apocalyptic, but futuristic, definitely. Set in London sometime in the future. The novel appeared in 2005. And earlier in 2021, Ishiguro has published, I don't know whether to call it a sequel, but a closely related novel called Clara and the Sun, which is also about an artificial friend or a clone. What does this tell us about corporeality? What does this tell us about trauma? The trauma of a group of people whose bodies are not their own. Women in Margaret Atwood's novel, The Handmaid's Tale, the clones in Never Let Me Go, suffer from cultural trauma because they have been marked for a particular purpose. They have no life outside the purpose determined for them by the state, by the government, by the culture in which they live. So they don't own their body. The state owns their body. They don't own the fetuses which they carry in their wombs because the state owns that as well. The body has been corporatized, commercialized, controlled. And the women in Atwood's novel, like the clones in Never Let Me Go, suffer from cultural trauma because they all live with, and please remember the term I used, they live within the category of biological citizenship, a citizenship marked by, a citizenship marked by the inevitable donation of their womb, the inevitable donation of their bodies, or more specifically, organs. Think of what these quote unquote people are. Are they people? Are the women in Margaret Atwood's novel persons? Are the clones persons? Cultural trauma here is the creation of biological citizenship where an entire species, an entire race, an entire group are constructed as biological citizens whose purpose, function, and goal in life is to serve the function, the requirements of the human being, of the human beings. This is what Kaushik Sundararajan calls live capital. The investment by the state or the corporation in the technologies that enable the making of clones. The clones, like the women, the clones in Never Let Me Go, like the women in The Handmaid's Tale, are slave bodies. That is precarious corporeality. That is trauma. An entire species of people, of persons, who are actually non-persons. Please get what I'm trying to say. Like I told you in an earlier moment, the slaves never owned their bodies. They were not recognized as persons. As Hitler would famously say about the Jews, well, Jews are a form of life, but they are not human. And he dismissed them as vermin. The point is, when we have reduced an entire life form, women, clones, to non-persons, that is an instance of cultural trauma for that entire species. They are trained that way. They are meant to be. They're designed that way. So the women in Handmaid's Tale do not know of any other way of life other than to be wombs. The clones know no other way. And I've put in a quote in one of the slides about Ruth, who says that in Never Let Me Go, that this is what I'm meant to do. So this is an investment made by the state in biology, live capital, flesh as capital, an investment in technology that makes use of that capital, that makes use of the flesh of biology, and in turn, therefore, producing as a consequence the trauma of those people. This is what has been called biocapitalism. Biocapitalism is the transformation of humans into objects. They don't own themselves. They have no agency. They don't own their organs. They're allowed to feel emotions, have sex, have likes and dislikes in food. But it's a very limited agency. So, cultural trauma for all of them is the making of their entire population as objects. They can be patented, they can be sold, they can be bought, they can be killed because they are not persons. They are objects. They carry, in the two cases that I mentioned, The Handmaid's Tale and Never Let Me Go, they carry something valuable within them. They carry a uterus, a womb in the case of Handmaid's Tale. They carry organs in the case of Never Let Me Go. And both of these, the womb and the organs, are meant to be given away. They don't own it. Margaret Atwood's text is, of course, now cult. And plenty of feminists have written about it and all that. But my interest is in this biocapitalism that operates to produce a certain kind of cultural trauma. So the women in Margaret Atwood's novel and the clones in Never Let Me Go are examples, embodiments of what we have been talking about as cultural trauma. They don't own their bodies. Anything can be done to them. The humans are kept alive only because the clones die in Never Let Me Go. That is, the clones must die so that the humans can live. Think of an entire race, an entire species of people, persons, who are treated as non-persons so that humans can survive. That is cultural trauma. A trauma citizenship of an entire group. I don't think you can call them ethnic communities, but definitely a social group, a species, a race. This is the point. They are subject to the power of the state, the power of the technology, biotechnology, which regulates them, grasps them, sells whatever they want, they can do. They don't own them. This is biopolitical power carried to its logical extreme. This is cultural trauma that comes via biopolitics, via biotechnology, and via a certain government-sponsored mechanism, a government-sponsored technology of subjugation. Okay? I now want to move to my second theme, which is the judicialization of life. It's a very awkward phrase, I understand. Let's talk briefly, before I go on to this, what we have looked at so far. Wombs are not their own. Bodies are not their own. Their organs are not their own. Who owns these? The state, the corporation, whatever it might be. And this is mediated via the medical realm, of course, right? In both The Handmaid's Tale and Never Let Me Go. The important thing to recognize here is these women in The Handmaid's Tale, their clones in Never Let Me Go, are kept alive and healthy. Why? The answer is fairly simple. They are kept alive because they are necessary for humanity to survive. This surveillance, this monitoring of clones, handmaids are the women who are meant for reproductive purposes in The Handmaid's Tale, and their tissues, their organs, their wombs, their heart. This is the judicialization of health because the law mandates that they be taken care of. Let's take a common example from our time. You need to be vaccinated now. You may require a vaccine passport at some point. You need to prove that you are vaccinated in order to step out into the world. It's linked to your Aadhaar, as we know, because you need one to get vaccinated. In each case, what is it you are seeing? You are seeing how a system of surveillance works via the medical field, to construct you in a certain biopolitical model. The necessity, the instructions to wash your hands, to wear your masks, 1, 2, 3, I don't know how many now we are supposed to wear. It, of course, has concealed a lot of ugliness, we might say. Nobody can recognize who's behind a mask. And I discover on my university campus, which is a very large campus, I am waving to perfect strangers who are waving at me. Neither of us knows the other. And I'm ignoring people who I actually do know, because I can't recognize anybody behind a mask. All to the good, I suppose. I mean, we can all be strangers to one another again. That's a nice thing. But in more academic terms, what has happened is the mandatory health checkup, the vaccination, the sanitizing regime, the quarantine, the lockdowns, and the ways in which certain zones are created as hotspots and they are shut down, They are containment zones. Think the nomenclature that has come into our lives since last March 2020. A whole new language of health, a whole new language of care has entered our lexicon, hasn't it? For people like me who have been interested in the social history of medicine for a very long time, it just proved what people like Michel Foucault spoke about in The Birth of the Clinic. When you look at films like Quarantine or Outbreak or I Am Legend, or any of those major pathogen films, so to speak, or you read graphic medicine, an area of interest for me, where there's a lot of graphic novels about medical conditions, from epilepsy to cancer. And we have a student who's actually working on cancer across media. And one of our focal areas is the graphic novel about cancer. Like I said, some of you, I'm sure, are worrying about my taste. And as people know, I have frequently been caught reading comics in my office room, and my senior colleagues, may they rest in peace, have always wondered why I'm being paid a salary to read comics. What can you do about it? Well, never mind. But think about our contemporary, almost dystopian, a medical dystopia, and think of how much of life and health has been judicialized, a part of a mandatory biomedical regimen. Think of the legislation, the frequent instructions from the Ministry of Health, from hospitals, from the Center for Disease Control, from the National Virology Laboratory, etc., etc., etc. I mean, the whole raft of things. Think of how much of a biomedicalization of the everyday has happened. I am not speaking about just the standard response that we are being misled. I'm not speaking about the misinformation overload that we suffer from. That's a different debate. Let's not get into that. I am speaking about how the biopolitics of our everyday life has been changed since last March. Also, if some of you are aware of this, we have become far more conscious. What is my O2 level? We have bought our oximeters, we are measuring our blood pressure, we are measuring our sugar levels. We are part of a biomedical regime. This is what I'm referring to as a judicialization of life. But there is one particularly significant component, and that is the judicialization of life also involves a commercial angle. And if you look at the slide there, which is from Oryx and Craik, the Margaret Atwood Volume 1 of the Mad Adam trilogy, that description is about coffee beans, about plants, and the other quotes which I have not put, about artificially created animals for food. All of these are actually instances of the link between the state and its legislation and the commercial enterprise. The judicialization of life is also about precarious lives, because we are constantly told, we are constantly cautioned that our life has to be led in a certain way because the government says so, the health department says so. On the other hand, you have hybrid genetically modified food, you have genetically altered vegetables and meats, part of the judicialized, commercialized entity. The reproduction of life, having been corporatized, having been rendered into something that the state is interested in, is the subject of numerous biocapitalist novels. One of my favorites is Paolo Bacigalupi's The Wind-Up Girl. It's an interesting novel because it's apocalyptic. The world has ended. And some of you might be aware of the fact that somewhere up in the north is a great seed vault, a seed vault. It's few kilometers under the snow, under the icy snow, and it contains seeds of crops. so that if the world were to be destroyed, the seeds will survive, and somebody, whoever survives, will be able to retrieve those seeds, and agriculture can start again, because people will still need food, even if you're like a zombie and eating others' brains, which is what teachers are supposed to be doing. But in this novel, even that seed vault has been destroyed, and the only country in the world where some seeds survive is Thailand, because Thailand refused to be part of the globalization process and closed its borders. It refused the intellectual property regimes and kept its seeds for itself. What Bakigalupi does is to speak about eco-crisis and therefore eco-trauma, which is one category of cultural trauma, as something that occurs around the world due to greed, due to corporate greed and biotechnology. So the point is, for Bakigalupi is the wind-up girl, the more you control life, crops, non-human, human life. So we are talking about a life, not the life, a life, any kind of life. You produce situations in which trauma will emerge. The more you judicialize life, the more you corporatize life, you are creating the potential for eco-trauma. And eco-trauma, let me underscore, is not about an individual species or race. Eco-trauma is cultural trauma across species, across the earth itself. Let me add one more layer to this. Eco-trauma is also the trauma inflicted upon non-living forms. For example, the shifts in land. You know the Uttarakhand, the Kerala landslides. You know about the shift in tectonic plates which produce tsunamis. Where do these come from? They come from deep sea mining, the kind of quarrying done in mountains, the endless excavations for uranium or whatnot that happens across the land in all parts of the world. And India is not particularly significant here, all parts of the world. The effects are not on life forms alone. The effects are also on geological substrates, the tectonic plates, minerals, land, water. You know about the rising sea levels. That's not trauma of the living kind, it's trauma of the non-living. But even they experience trauma. So what you're looking at is eco-trauma is trauma on a much larger scale. It's a planetary level of trauma. And where human life, human technology, human greed, foundational to humans, produce this vast traumatic condition. So the important thing to understand is that cultural trauma has multiple dimensions, and this is my conclusion. First, cultural trauma is the inheritance, the transmissible trauma of a people, of a particular group of people. It has its memory systems. It produces a memory citizenship, what I've referred to as a trauma memory citizenship, and where you all belong because you are descendants of people who have been traumatized or treated badly, who have been the victims of genocide or persecution or whatnot. This cultural trauma, shared by many, can be read at two levels, which is what I did. The corporeal precarity of life and the judicialization of life. What I have concluded with is a far bigger trauma of a much larger magnitude, shall we say. Eco-trauma is not immediately visible. Rob Nixon will speak about slow violence, the slow, gradual, incremental violence upon the land, which will include climate change, species death, the extinction discourse that we read about in newspapers now. But eco-trauma is on a global, on a planetary scale. It's not, like I said, immediately tangible. It also takes a long time. For example, climate change is not immediately tangible. It's measurable. You see minor changes. But the rise in sea levels, the change in temperatures, the shifts in tectonic plates, the change in tidal formations are not immediately tangible. They take time. So this is eco-trauma, which is a much more expanded version of cultural trauma itself. It's a planetary scale. It's on a planetary scale. It includes, and this is important, it includes humans, non-human life forms, and the non-living as well. So please understand the expanding nature of trauma that I'm talking about. Humans, subject to biopolitics, individuals, then one individual, communities and populations, they expand, all right? So a larger group of people. Then it expands further to include non-human life forms, animals and plants, and then yet larger non-living forms as well. So you start with the individual, so trauma at the level of the individual, trauma at the level of the community, which would be our cultural trauma, trauma at the level of non-human life forms, trauma at the level of the non-living. So you expand and then talk about trauma. You talk about the injurability, the vulnerability of individuals, but you can also speak about the vulnerability of the planet, basically climate change. You can speak about the helplessness of large communities of people, which would be genocidal regimes, such as what you see in Sudan currently, Somalia, Congo, and many other places. So what I'm urging you to see, to note, is that you need to think of trauma as something beyond the individual. You need to see trauma as something that has to be expanded far, far beyond. Far beyond one individual, one group of people, or even one species, which is the human. So once you expand it beyond one individual, one community, one race, to include much larger magnitudes. So when studying trauma, one should be careful not to opt for one or the other, which is why I began by making this comment that please do not think that we are dismissing individual traumatic conditions. No, we are not dismissing psychological trauma. My point is that it is not adequate when we want to speak about something much larger. I'm going to stop here, so we will have, by my watch, about 15 minutes for discussion. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Nayar. That was quite an exhaustive deliberation on the topic. We have some questions. I always tell my students that, the proof of a text well done is the sort of discussion it generates. So this talk has also generated a lot of discussion and some questions. Some questions I find myself difficult to understand, so I'm going to read them out to you as is some of them. Okay. So right. If you have caught your breath, can I proceed?
Please, yes.
Yeah. Now, this is by Priyal Panchal. She's a research scholar, and she has a question. She has read your books. So, yeah. Sir, your book on citizenship and identity talks about biosurveillance, which seems much more relevant in the current times of the pandemic, which you have already addressed, I'm sure. Then she asked, do you foresee a crucial role of your writings about biosurveillance in the post-pandemic times? That's one. There is a follow-up question to it. Then she asks, is it relevant to connect the current pandemic-related surveillance with Foucault's idea of surveillance?
Well, the first part about my writings, Priyal, right?
Yeah, Priya.
I'm sorry, but I'm not a prophet. I do not know what my writings will do in the future. That's not something I can anticipate. My job is to write. What people make of it, I cannot be very clear. The second one, well, the Foucault paradigm of surveillance has already been questioned, Priyal, because the top-down panoptical model is no longer a valid one. If you look at Edward Snowden's work on surveillance, once he revealed the mass surveillance systems of the governments across the world, especially the National Security Agency of the United States, we now speak not of surveillance, but of surveillance at the ground level. It's sometimes called sousveillance, S-O-U-S, sousveillance, which is at the ground level. We surveil each other. So I do not think it's any longer possible to think in terms of a top-down panoptical model, which is the Foucault model and the Bentham model from where Foucault takes his work. But a lot of surveillance which you see now is at the level of this, the ground level. So it's called sousveillance, S-O-U-S-V-E-I-L-L-A-N-C-E. And the other kind of surveillance is what we willingly subject ourselves to, where we volunteer to be surveilled, which includes the medical angle, which I have already mentioned, where we accept that surveillance is necessary, where we accept that this is a good thing. This is an important part of what I am trying to get at in my work on surveillance as well, that this is routine now. This is intrinsic and integral to what we do now. And the fact that at no point do we see this as a top-down system, because we are a part of it. We are integral to, and surveillance is integral to our lives. In other words, we are looking at surveillance which we have more or less accepted as constitutive of who we are. So I don't think the top-down model of the panopticon is relevant anymore. Yeah, that's my answer.
All right. I hope, Priyal, you're satisfied with that. I can see your hand that has gone up, but let me address a few more questions, and then probably we'll circle back to Priyal again. Yeah. This is from Rajdeep. He is also your student, I think. Yes, and he has asked, while the codependency of humans on other species has been a fact of nature, has this idea, or rather worry about this idea, the idea of eco-precarity, come into existence only in the modern era? He references to the movie examples that you have given, okay, which are quite current. Or has this been seen in texts across the ages? If yes, what can be the reasons behind this?
Well, the reasons are many. Historical trends in thought are always going to be varied. And many cultures have spoken about the intrinsic connections between species, races, and forms of life. Native American, Indian, African. The point is, with the rise of a certain kind of attitude such as modernity and industrial capitalism, or capitalist modernity as it's called, you begin to see massive shifts in attitude towards other creatures, other life forms. And therefore, a concomitant reduction of value of other life forms. So the idea that the human species, the human race, is far more superior to the others is a process which is an idea that has evolved over a considerable period of time, which ignored the other forms of thinking on the subject. The fact that these are being retrieved is an important, again, intellectual shift in thought. Why it has come about, it's a huge debate, and which we really do not think, I don't think we should go into at this point. But enough to say that if you read people like Deepesh Chakrabarty, or you read Native American creation myths, you see that there has always been a sense that all life is connected. So it has existed before. it has now come back into prominence because we are suddenly aware that we have been complete idiots as a race.
All right. Rajdeep, I hope you're satisfied with that. Thank you so much. So, next question, if you don't mind. Yeah. This is regarding trauma again. And this is from Sayoni. She's a student, our student. And she asks, how can the trauma of seeing and meeting people, not only as people, but as vectors of a disease, go on with a society that values interaction and is collectivistic like India? So she's again asking you to be slightly, predict what's going to happen. But yeah.
Well, yeah, I like I said, I'm not a prophet, so I don't know how that will go. But one of the things you have discovered, and your generation actually should be more aware of this than my generation, practically all your interactions are online. How do you even understand vectors? Your life is online. I don't know whether you even understand offline life. You have fitted into, because you're all what is generally referred to as the digital native generation, as opposed to me, I'm a digital migrant because I migrated to the digital world and digital technology. You're used to isolated lives. You're used to a form of social interaction which is 80% online and only 20%, if at all, offline. So we have seen that shift already over the last decade or so. And for a generation brought up on and in social media, digital technologies and smartphones, the nature of interaction has been differently defined. So I don't really see that as a problem.
All right. Thank you, sir. The next question then, this is from Ananya, our student again. And she asks, biopolitics is used as a weapon to capitalize human bodies. Does this explain about the social injustice between the first world and the third world? What is the future of biopolitics? Will this be eradicated for moral reasons?
No, it will not be eradicated because we cannot work without biopolitics. We all live within biopolitics. There's no question of it being eradicated. We will modify it. New legislations will come. New technologies will come. Some emancipatory, some more exploitative. Those will come, as it has always happened. The history of humanity is a history of its technology, and it's a history of its exploitation as well. You can't separate the two any longer. Regarding the first world, third world, yes. Biopolitical regimes, which include surrogacy. I have a colleague in another department who works on surrogacy, and she is part of the committee that looks into that is advising the government on the surrogacy bill. Surrogacy is biopolitics of a certain kind. Organ trafficking is biopolitics of a different kind. So the purchasing power of the first world over the third world has entered the realm of the biopolitical as well. And if you look at medical tourism, organ trafficking, all of these are first world versus the third world. So you're absolutely spot on when you say it is a part of a first world versus third world divide. Good point. Thank you.
A follow-up question, and this is by Sam. Okay, now he is worrying that this might actually lead to a splintering of society into, tribal groups along communities.
Oh, you mean we are not already splintered? That's interesting. We always have thought our society has been splintered for a very long time, whether it is caste or community or gender. So what would be new? It will just be divided into people who have enhanced themselves and people who have not. Those who are posthuman, those who are not. Those who are morally, intellectually, physically enhanced and augmented, and those who are normal, if we can understand what we mean by normal. We've always been splintered. The myth that we are a unified society is just that. It's a myth. We have never been coherent and unified. We have always been divisive and divided.
Okay, so then I think the other side then, yeah? And this is from Anupa, and she asks whether you can see COVID-19 pandemic evolving into a cultural trauma that would then be collective.
It already is. It already is. I would recommend you look up public writings on this. I have a colleague who has written about in the Wire on why we do not mourn COVID-19. Wire carried two of her pieces on that, on the inability to mourn and the inability to memorialize COVID-19 deaths particularly, it is already cultural trauma. It has been from day one. It has manifested differently. For example, certain countries in the world said the senior citizens will not be entitled to hospital care, but the younger ones would be. People have been speaking about the ageist nature of COVID-19 treatment processes, the medical protocols that have been put in place. That has already been discussed. An entire issue of Human Rights Quarterly, one of the world's top journals, was devoted to COVID-19 and human rights. So it's there. I can send you any number of references on that. But yes, COVID-19 has generated an enormous amount of cultural trauma. Think of the migrant workers walking. Think of people dying because of oxygen shortage. Think of people dying because of inappropriate vaccination. Think of people dying because they have experienced vaccine hesitancy and refuse to take vaccine, etc. It is cultural trauma.
Yes, thank you, sir. Slightly, again, expecting you to be the prophet, but yeah. And Shaina wants to know.
I should diversify my profession. Clearly.
No, that itself, I think, is an indication of the trauma that we are actually going through, isn't it? They want answers, and there you are. So, so this person, Shaina, wants to know what is the role of AI playing in eco-precarity of human species. Will the future tryst be with a new man made by man? So the role of AI, and artificial intelligence.
I don't know why we need to worry about it, because we are already part of that system. I would ask the students here whether they can be separated from their smartphones for an hour, unless it is at gunpoint. We can't find our places, our destination, without using a GPS and Google Maps. We can't live without those smartphones. As I sometimes say, just to annoy my students, our generation didn't need smartphones. Your generation does, because between you and the smartphone, at least one of you should be smart. Thank goodness you have phones. Otherwise, where would you be? You can't find your way in broad daylight because you need a GPS. I know that's rather insulting, but yeah, I don't try to win popularity contests. But the point is, we have been living within an AI-dominated world for a very long time. We've been living within a setup where ambient surveillance is part of our lives, whether it is a mechanism, that little apparatus that at the gates, which beeps when you go past. From there to how you have been algorithmically determined the minute you put in your Aadhaar number, your PAN number, and all that. So we are already part of it. It has become more prominent in our consciousness. But I will also tell you that more and more surveillance technologies which use AI are ubiquitous and ambient. As in, there will not be a camera up there like that to photograph you. Think of the digital footprints you leave when you log on to Amazon and make a purchase. So we are already in the system. Now, whether it will produce a new human, we are already new humans, aren't we? We live with technology. We have adapted to it. We have co-created ourselves through it. So is it an entirely new thing is my question. It's not. I don't think so. I think it is a part and parcel of how we have lived for the past several years. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, sir. There is another question, and this is from Sejal. She wants to know, bioscientific and biotechnical knowledge are emerging as a realm where politics has found ways to endorse some practices. So she's basically looking at panopticism here again, okay? She's asking, what are the implications of this fact?
The implications are that biology cannot be taken for granted as something you own. Biology is as enmeshed in technological, legislative, and social regulatory norms as anything else. In fact, in the 21st century, the greater amount of investment is in biology compared to anything else. So whether it is biotechnology or biochemistry or computational biology or systems biology, the investment in biological matter is all that matters, so to speak. So the implications are very simple. Think of the Fitbit people have started wearing. We have biomedicalized ourselves because our health is our concern, our health is to be monitored, and you discover that more and more technologies that we evolve, which we purchase, which we consume, which we adapt to, makes for an extremely biomedicalized life now. That is the implication. It's a question of how much you want to adopt and how much you don't. Most people in the COVID era had bought oximeters. Why? Because you believe, oh, it's absolutely important that you have. Then you look at, say, older parents or children as more vulnerable groups, and you set about creating an environment you safe. We know people have been on dialysis machines and pacemakers for a very long time. It has been enhanced. So what I'm saying is this is not new. It is merely amplified. That's all. Thank you.
Yes, sorry, yes, probably one or two more questions. But this seems to be, yeah, thank you. Now, this is by Prachi. She's an MA student, and she wants to know, this is something from the other point, from the other side, okay? Now, she wants to know, when dealing with trauma, specifically war, Holocaust, and partition trauma, how do you narrate those experiences without taking away from the survivors?
You can't.
Yeah.
You can't. As has been illustrated time and time again, and I would urge you to read somebody called Dominic Lacapra, who speaks about primary and secondary witnesses. When you speak on behalf of somebody, you have to try and make sure you don't stand in their shoes. You can empathize, but you don't stand in their shoes. The primary witness, the one who has suffered, you are the secondary witness to whom the primary witness tells the story. But think about it. Any trauma has to be mediated. When people speak about unmediated trauma, they are lying or they are under an illusion. All trauma is mediated because first it requires a language, it requires a listener, it requires a narrative. So there is no such thing as a trauma without a narrative component. And if you are looking at, say, African American text or Dalit text or whatever, the one who experienced narrates it. The one who is narrated to puts it into a certain voice, into a certain form. Now tell me, when you read a text like that, whose text are you reading? Are you reading the text of the editor and the translator, or are you reading the text of the Dalit or the Jewish Holocaust victim survivor, or you're reading the African American slave? All trauma has been mediated with multiple layers. And when people say we are looking for the original voice, that's nonsensical. There's no such thing as an original voice. It cannot be. Because even the primary victim who has suffered will articulate his or her trauma through language, and language is social. Language belongs to somebody else as well. He or she will speak in a narrative form, which would be a testimony, it would be a confession, it would be tears, crying about something, whatever. Those are all forms that are social. So there is no such thing as trauma without a language. Trauma has a language. Trauma requires a language.
I loved that answer, sir. Yeah, yeah. Sorry to have. Yeah. Now, one more question from Priyal. She seems to be a particular fan. Unrelated question though, with reference to your other book. Okay. She says your book titled "Human Rights and Literature" is unique and brings together two different areas of study: human rights and literature. She wants to know whether it was difficult to claim this space as a literati, since human rights is more often associated with other social sciences. So in terms of appropriation, I think is what she wants to know.
I think Priyal is particularly astute about it. In fact, one of the reviewers of the manuscript, or I think it's the proposal, because it went to Palgrave, was a little puzzled as to why a literature person is writing about human rights and not a political scientist. But I did a human rights book in 2012. It was called Righting Wrongs. It's a cultural construction of human rights in India, which was also a Routledge book. My point was, the task of discussing human rights cannot be left to the political scientists and, for God's sake, not the politicians alone. There is no field which discusses the construction of the human better than literature does. Harold Bloom would title his huge book on Shakespeare, The Invention of the Human, because Shakespeare gave us a language in which to speak about the human. Human rights is a lingua franca. Human rights talks about humans, and which discipline talks about humans better than literature does? After all, when, for example, you read a Dickens novel, how do we talk about it? We say, oh, Oliver Twist did this. We don't say Oliver Twist, a character created by Charles Dickens in a fictional work, said this. We talk about Oliver Twist as though Oliver Twist is one of you and me. We speak about Oliver Twist as though he is a living person. The definitions of the human, the contours of the human, the idea of the human comes to us because there is a literary language in which this is crafted. Whether it is the emotional, so you can always say that biological sciences also give us the human. Yes, if you can think of a whole bunch of molecules with a certain chemical reaction and want to call it human, be my guest. But nobody defines the human better than literature does. It's the only field in which you can get the entire nature of a human, nature within quotes. And hence this. My second response to Priyal's point is, if the literature people don't talk about humanity and the human, and therefore of human rights, who will? That is our job. I worked in this field for the past 10 years now. I have published 2 books, I published 3 books on human rights. The new one came out on the graphic novel. I continue to work in that field precisely because I find literature is the richest domain in which we can identify, describe, understand the human. For instance, is there a field which tells us what a character is thinking, what a human is thinking? It's only literature that does that for you. So yes, that's the reason. It was not difficult in that sense. It's difficult in another sense, if I may take a minute more to respond to Priyal's question. Working in human rights and literature is a very dismal, frighteningly oppressive, and mind-shatteringly horrific work. My work in these fields has consistently been looking at texts of mass rape, genocide, mutilation, death. For the past 10 years, this is what I've been doing, including Bhopal, extreme cultures and things like that. So the texts that you read are of extremely gruesome violence, extreme suffering, and extreme oppression. So my work has looked at Dalit texts, African American texts, war memoirs, graphic novels that are about extreme violence, you name it. So the reading of those texts has been, shall we say, traumatic. It's extremely hard to read them on a sustained basis because they are uniformly depressing, they're uniformly frightening, and they are terribly, terribly sad. And when you read those texts, you realize that, as my colleague and friend would say, horror is not what happens through extraterrestrial means. Horror is what humans do to each other. That's my friend Anna Kurian's definition of horror. Horror is what humans are capable of doing to other humans. What we do to other humans. And that makes for extremely difficult reading. So the texts I read are insane in one sense, and they are brutal. And the more you read of that, the less you believe in humanity. And you begin to believe that humanity is best wiped off from the surface of the earth. Because, as somebody said the other day, it's only humans who thirst for revenge. There's no other form of life that actually quests for revenge. Revenge is not justice, let's understand that. So that way, those books have been difficult to do. Right from the time I wrote Righting Wrongs, which was 2012, and then 2017, I forget when I published Human Rights and Literature from Palgrave Springer, and the new one, but also my other books on Bhopal and extreme cultures. And my forthcoming book, which will come maybe end of this year, is on Alzheimer's disease memoirs, which is equally difficult to write because the material I'm working with is extremely distressing. So yeah, it's not easy.
Excellent, sir. Then I have a related question since you mentioned Alzheimer's, This is from Akanksha. She wants to know So she says this, okay, so can we say cultural trauma is genetic as well? Okay, or is it only caused by societal and environmental factors?
No, it's not entirely this or that. And to make an argument that it is genetic is to lapse into a biological determinism, which would not be quite appropriate because let's take the disability studies argument. Uh, People are different, but structural conditions mean that certain people cannot function. For example, all our doors latches are designed for right-handed people, not for left-handed ones. Now, a left-hand preference is not a disability. The point is people are impaired, but when they encounter a structural social condition, they become disabled. There's a difference between impairment and disability. Impairment is a quality of their body. Disability is the encounter of that body with a social setting. And the social setting prevents you from performing in a certain way. So for people with orthopedically altered or different legs or limbs, negotiating stairs is a problem. It is not that their body is a problem. Negotiating the stairs with their bodies is a problem. So to say that it's entirely genetic is not true. So in the work I have done and in the book that's forthcoming on the Alzheimer's disease memoirs, you discover that it's a social setting in which that genetic condition manifests itself. I've also worked on things like the Huntington's disease memoirs. Huntington's disease is often seen as the world's cruelest disease because it lasts for 20 years. It takes a very long time to kill you, basically. It starts with tremors and abusive speech. But it's also something that manifests when you're 30, by which time you have already usually had children. And if you have Huntington's disease gene, there's a 50% chance that your children get it, which means people who get it are condemned to live with the fact that they've also transmitted it to their children. Now, the point I'm making is there is, on the one hand, the genetic condition, on the other hand, the manifestation in the body, and the third is the engagement, the negotiation of that body with a social setup, with a structural condition like buildings or pavements or streets or stairs or whatever it might be. So I would hesitate to say that this trauma emanates only from the genetic condition. No, it doesn't.
Thank you so much, sir. There are more questions, but I think at this point of time, I would rather not be part of cloning. So I would thank you so much. Okay, I'm sure students thoroughly enjoyed it, and so other people, those who are here. I would request Vidya to take over and continue with the vote of thanks. Thank you so much, Dr. Nayar.
Thank you.
Dr. Nayar, I must say that I have not enjoyed my Saturday evening in a long time like this. Listening to you, it is quite ironical to say that something on cultural trauma has provided so much pleasure to the listeners, but it has been a most enlightening talk. I think we are going to go back with a whole lot of information and a lot of things to think about. There has been work done in the West on these topics, but this is all new to us, especially our students. And I think there is a scope for more research in India, especially with the pandemic and the kind of sense that we are trying to make of what has befallen us because of virus. A lot of people are thinking about, how do I make sense of what has befallen me? There are people who have worked on it, like Bronwyn Parry, Stephanie Fischel. I myself wanted to ask you a question about bioprospecting, but I think if you will be kind enough to allow us to mail you some questions that are still pending and
that
you
might be
reply
good.
to them, that would be wonderful. Because I thought, yes, that there are many more very interesting questions, very topical ones. And as my colleague Seema said, we have got you to answer them now. So it would be wonderful if you could respond.
That's fine. We can do that. We can do that.
Thank you so much, sir. It's wonderful of you. It was wonderful listening to you. And I think I'll go back with more questions than when I came in, because I want to read up more on this subject. Thank you so much. I wish to thank the management of SIS College, which has always stood by us in all our ventures whenever we have wanted to organize webinars, seminars, or anything. I wish to thank our principal, Dr. Uma Shankar. Ma'am is still here. Thank you so much, ma'am, for motivating us constantly to achieve greater heights, whether it's organizing national seminars, international seminars, inviting guests to speak to us. You've always been with us throughout this. I wish to thank my colleagues from the CS and IT departments, computer science and IT, because without them, I think we could not have done this. My student volunteers, who under the able leadership of Anupa and Shejal, the coordinators, have, I think, spent sleepless nights because we have been asking them to do this, that, and the other, and they have done it wonderfully well. Last but not the least, I want to thank all the participants who have stayed with us throughout. There has not been a single demand for, putting across the feedback form. So that, I think, attests to the absolute success of your lecture, sir, because it has been so spellbinding that nobody has asked for anything further. They've only asked questions, which I think I will mail to you now. So I think we can consider your talk to be an absolute success. It was wonderful. The feedback form will be put up on the.
It's already been posted in the
Yes,
chat
and
box.
on the YouTube channel. So we have had participants, more than 300 who are listening in both national and international. We have participants from Dhaka, from UAE, Sharjah, as well as other states in India. So I would request the participants to be a little bit patient. It will take us some time to send you your certificates, because we can do only auto certificates of 100. The system allows us only to send 100 certificates per day. So please be patient with us. And thank you so much for being with us today. And I hope to see all of you in all our other webinars which we will be organizing. So I request you to stay behind, because there will be a small photo session with our volunteer team. Please. So your session was live on YouTube also. So we had, some people who were listening via YouTube. And there were some questions posted there, which my colleague had asked you. It's very kind of you to allow us to send you questions via mail, and we would like to hear your thoughts on, I've recently started reading about trauma, memory, and biopolitics and climate change, and because we were going to have a talk on this, so sourcing materials on this, reading up. But I must say it was an entirely learning experience for me. It was wonderful to be able to read these things. I had attended a seminar last year in September 2020, which was on posthumanism, and that's where I came across the works of Bronwyn Parry and Stephanie Fischel, and started reading on them. Though not I couldn't understand everything, but yes. Seema, can you turn your video on, Lakshmi ma'am, so we can have a pic with sir?
Yeah.
It was an absolute delight, sir. Thank you so much for patiently answering all our students' questions.
I generally answer student questions. I don't answer faculty questions.
Yeah, somehow
Yes,
we knew
sir.
that.
Thank you.
Let me see.
Right.
So we have a bit of a photo bombing here. I told you.
You know what?
I'll see if I can do something about it.
No,
Okay.
no, it's fine. It's fine.
Yeah, quick Vidya before we have another.
I know, please, please.
Yeah.
I think I got it. Should I try again? You doing it too?
Yeah, I am.
I'm not shown along with the others. What should I do?
Ma'am, you are with us. Don't
Yeah,
worry.
yeah, you are.
I,
Yes.
I can't see that. Okay.